Okay, so I am joined today by Ashley South, who is a journalist and a expert on Burma. And when I say an expert, the man has been involved in the affairs of Myanmar, the government there, and in the various ethnic armed organisations, and so the ongoing civil war for 30 years now.
Coming on for 30
Wow,
years.
yeah. And has literally had front row seats at a lot of the major events. So I'm really privileged to have him on today to talk about his experiences and about the situation in Myanmar and the future and what that might hold. So thank you, Ashley, for coming on the podcast.
Very happy to be here. Thank you. I should say probably at the outset that I do publish sometimes op-ed pieces in the media. I'm not really a journalist. I'm more of a sort of academic slash analyst slash consultant
Fair enough. That
with
sounds
respect to people who are like proper full-time professional journalists. But
well. Most professional journalists don't actually turn up in Myanmar very often, so
right,
we take what we can get. No, honestly, it's a real privilege because it's like we've had plenty of conversations before, and you always impress me by your depth of knowledge and your experiences in Myanmar. So, if we could start, I suppose we should sort of do a bit of a potted history about Burma, Myanmar, because most people are aware of it since the coup. But obviously, the history of Myanmar is the civil war has been going on for decades now. So, could you give us some background on that?
well, decades is right. I think we could say that the Civil War really kicked off, and here is the thunder pealing
It's
symbolically.
foreboding,
Yeah,
yeah.
um, pretty much since independence in 1948.
48, yeah.
Yeah, so the Karen insurgency, I think, is usually dated to the Battle of Insane, which kicked off January 1949 and continued through to the end of March
Yeah.
when the Karen rebels, the KNDO, were forced to withdraw from the suburbs of Rangoon,
Yeah, I mean,
and
they
they've been
pushed,
fighting ever since.
I mean, that they effectively invaded and pushed all the way up to the capital, didn't they, back
They
then?
did, and in those days, much of the Burma army was made up of Karen and
Mm.
Chin and other ethnic minority soldiers who had been trained up under the British.
Yeah,
And
I think
so
deliberate policy, wasn't it?
yeah. I mean, you could say it was a divide and rule policy, but what it meant was at the time of independence, there were many ethnic nationality young men who were trained and armed, and they were not given the opportunity to establish their own self-determination states at
Mm.
the time of independence, which is something that was kind of promised during World War II to the Karen and others who fought on the side of the British against the Japanese. And
Yeah.
when those promises weren't fulfilled, a lot of Karen and Kachin and other soldiers took up arms to fight for their country, and
Yeah.
that was
And there was a lot of bad blood because a lot of the Bama, who are the majority, sided with the Japanese, and there was a whole raft of atrocities occurred in those final years of the war and in the immediate period after.
people still talk about it. Yeah,
Mm.
massacres of Karen villagers by the Bama Independence Army
Mm.
that was established by General Aung San and originally entered Burma together with the Japanese in 1942 and sided with the Japanese
Yeah.
until the last year of World War II when the Burmese nationalists switched to the British side, I think,
Yeah.
realizing that the Brits were going to win World War II. And really, back from those days, there was antipathy between elites in the Burmese nationalist community and Karen and other minority communities who were accused of siding with the British. I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of this does come from elites. I mean, what regular villagers really thought about this, I don't think we really know.
Yeah.
But certainly that was the narrative back then, was the Karen had sided with the British. And of course, that's in some ways really a distortion and oversimplification. But it is also true that the idea of Karen nationalism, and this would be the same for several of the upland minority communities of Burma, really came to political consciousness during the British period as a
Mm.
result of the missionary efforts to provide education and to build a sense of community among ethnic people. This did lead to the emergence of national consciousness. So
Yeah.
I think in some ways it is reasonable to say that Karen and other ethnic nationalist movements came out of the colonial period.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you say, it's interesting you mentioned the elites because I suspect that's a theme that's going to reoccur as we continue to discuss this the whole situation in Myanmar up until the current and the current day and the future. So obviously we've had decades of war running up until the 2010s when there was glimmers of hope of a peace deal finally between the major ethnic groups and the central government, and that's something you actually played a part in.
Yeah, I mean, my role was very much a bit part, but I did have a front row seat as an observer. And of course, there's a lot to say about the subject, but there were elections held in 2010 under the 2008 Constitution, which led to the creation of a military backed government under the USDP, led by ex-General Thein Sein. I think very few observers really had much expectation that this was going to be any different to previous
Mm.
military governments. But it turned out that the U Thein Sein administration had significantly more interest in reform than previous military governments. And I think, on the one hand, there was a lot of low hanging fruit. I mean, Myanmar, was one of the most oppressive countries in Southeast Asia.
Mm.
So it wasn't too difficult to turn that around. And
Yeah.
nevertheless, in the first few years under the U Thein Sein administration, nearly all political prisoners were released. There was a great increase in freedom of association. Media was mostly freed up during that period. I remember, I had been visiting Yangon for a few years already at this point, and how surprised and pleased I was to be able to access the Irrawaddy website. And I have my own website, and when I could access my own website from Yangon, that was kind of like a real milestone. So anyway, there was a reform movement under President U Thein Sein, including what started off as a series of ceasefires with ethnic armed organizations. And
Mm.
we've been talking about the Karen National Union, which is probably the best known, most long standing ethnic insurgency in Myanmar, but there are dozens, depending how you count, even hundreds of ethnic armed
Yeah.
organizations in the country. And most of those groups, some of them had agreed ceasefires with the previous military government in the 1990s. So that would be the case with the WA, with the New Mon State Party. But many of the groups, like the Karen National Union, had not agreed ceasefires until 2011, 2012, when
Yeah.
a series of bilateral ceasefires were negotiated by the military backed government.
Yeah.
Fast forward a couple of 3 years, and that led to the negotiation of the nationwide ceasefire agreement formalized in October 2015. I think at that point it was already becoming obvious that the peace process had some pretty major flaws.
Yeah.
But I think there was a period 2012 through to 2014 when there was real excitement and hope that
Mm.
maybe something different was happening in Burma.
Yeah.
I mean, looking back, the KNU had been fighting, as I said, from 1949 until 2012, and that strategy of armed conflict hadn't really produced the political results that were
Mm.
hoped for in terms of achieving some kind of self-determination for the Karen. And there had been massive humanitarian suffering and generations of civilians losing lives and education and livelihoods. So my view at the time and still now is that it was worth trying a different strategy.
Yeah.
I think the result of that experiment was to see that the peace process was ultimately a failure,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that actually the Myanmar army and government were not willing to really address the underlying grievances and aspirations of ethnic communities. But
I've got one question. So, do you think the interest by the central government, by the military, to do peace deals, particularly with the Karen, may have had in 2011 they started fighting the Kachin, and it
mm,
was like, and that was a big conflict. Kachin were much more developed, certainly militarily, and were a much bigger challenge. And I know the Tatmadaw suffered seriously in conquering the parts of Kachin they did. Do you think that might have played a part in the sudden interest in doing a deal?
yeah, I think
Yeah,
so. Looking back, yeah, you're quite right that just a few months before the KNU ceasefire, the Kachin ceasefire broke down.
yeah,
So the Kachin Independence Organization agreed a ceasefire in 1994. That was one of the earlier waves
yeah.
of truces that I mentioned. And I think it's not a coincidence that the Myanmar army provoked a return to armed conflict with the Kachin
Yeah,
just a few months before they negotiated a ceasefire with the Karen.
yeah,
And so I think back in the 1990s, ceasefires were agreed with a lot of armed organizations in the north of the country. Fighting continued in the southeast.
Hmm.
And then the story of the 2010s was most of the ceasefires from that period, not all, but most of them were agreed with groups in the southeast,
Mm.
and fighting recommenced in the north. So
Yeah,
I think it does speak to the divide and rule strategy of the Myanmar army. And that's really what they do. They're experts in
absolutely. Yeah,
conflict and violence. And I think it's probably quite threatening to the Myanmar army to be faced with a prospect of no armed conflict and actually having to deal with these issues politically.
yeah.
I think that was a real challenge. And that's what I remember particularly one of the KNU leaders from that period, Puro David Tor, who actually died less than a year after the KNU ceasefire was agreed. And he was the architect, really, of the KNU
Mm.
ceasefire agreement. A lovely man, very, very wise, funny, intelligent. And his strategy was that we need to put the Myanmar army back in the box. Everyone knows the Myanmar army can fight, but we think they're not very good at politics. They're not very good at peace.
No, yeah,
So we need to find a different strategy. We need to actually continue the struggle through political means in a terrain and domain which the Myanmar army isn't comfortable with,
yeah.
i.e., political negotiations.
Well, was the old maxim? If you have a hammer, every problem is a nail. And that's
And that sounds right to
and
the Myanmar
that would be
army.
a
Yeah,
problem. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
the one trick pony.
Yeah, and we can
Uh,
see that, I think, with events of the last three
exactly. Yeah,
years. Yeah.
absolutely. So, what do you think happened with the run? So we had the coup in February 2021. What do you think caused that? What was the series of events that led to that?
Well,
Because obviously there was some sort
I've
of
got
power
my
struggle between the political Aung San Suu Kyi and the military.
I have my views on the political consequences of the coup, but in fact, what caused the coup seems to be the stupidity and selfishness of Min Aung Hlaing.
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
there have been coups in Burma before in 1962, Ne Win's coup, and then 1988.
Yeah.
And I think in both cases, the coup really was launched in order to promote the interests of a sort of narrow military ruling class. But there was some kind of narrative of the military stepping in to save the country. From in
Yeah.
1962, the idea was that the civilian government was going to give away the country to the
Yeah.
ethnic groups
Yeah.
through agreeing to some kind of federal political settlement. And in 1988, there were widespread street demonstrations against military rule,
And
which the
massive.
army, massive bloodshed, and the army saw this as a threat which they put down with violence.
Yeah.
In 2021, really, there was no proper rationale. So the narrative of Min Aung Hlaing would be that the election was fake and stolen by the NLD government at the time. And on this question, just last week, actually, I was in Mae Sot talking to some civil disobedience movement CDM
Yeah.
teachers.
Yeah.
And I was asking these teachers about their experience of the coup, and they had been election workers at the time of the polls in October 2020. And they were really quite angry, like so many people, about the military takeover. But
Yeah.
particularly the teachers were saying, we volunteered to be election workers. We
Yeah.
know that the election was fair.
Yeah.
We were there. That was our job. And then to be told that this was a fake election, it really made them angry. And I think partly explains why there was such a huge upsurge of protest.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that Min Aung Hlaing must have thought that he could deliver a coup like we've had in Thailand quite a few times over the years,
Yeah.
where the military takes over and students and a few others go onto the
Protest. Yeah.
streets,
Like,
and the international community protests, but it kind of dies down pretty quickly.
I wonder if he expects to be at worst a repeat of '88, which is okay. They'll be out on the streets in Yangon, and we'll kill them, and that'll be that. And that's kind of what they tried to do, but they have inflamed so many people. And this is what you see in the people now is like when you talk to people, a lot of the young volunteers who are now with the EAOs, or they're very, very motivated, very, very fired up, and far more optimistic about the future than the old guard, the old fighters who've been fighting for a long time and seen
Mm.
it all and seen machinations of not just the central government and the Burma army, but also the other EAOs, even their own political leadership sometimes. So it's an interesting situation with a lot of new blood coming in, but not necessarily everyone's gelling this like pulling the same
No,
way.
I think that's a really important point. I think the area of common unity is around disgust with the Myanmar army,
Yeah.
and frustration and anger at the complete lack of any rationale
Mm.
for launching a military coup. except it seems that Min Aung Hlaing wanted to be president,
Yeah,
and he lost the election. And I mean, he really lost the election by a huge margin.
yeah.
And so then this narrative was cooked up that somehow the election had been stolen by the NLD, which I'm no great fan of the NLD. I think they were pretty poor as a government of Myanmar in the 5 years before the election.
Mhm.
But I also think it's really obvious that they won the election,
Yeah.
and the idea that this was somehow a fake poll is ridiculous.
Yeah,
And the fact that Min Aung Hlaing had to resort to this narrative, I think, kind of shows how weak his understanding of his own country is. And I think it's that sort of barefaced stealing of people's futures. And those young people that you're talking about, I mean, up until 2010, let's say maybe even 2015, Burma, Myanmar had been such an isolated country
mm,
under decades of military rule. Most people had had very little experience of improving living standards.
mm,
Like I was saying, up until 2011, 12, 13, you couldn't access the internet except
mm.
for like very heavily surveilled internet cafes, maybe. But there was a period of opening from around then until the time of the coup, where young people had an expectation of a better future. The Myanmar economy is in such a mess now, and it was in quite a mess before the coup, but things were improving. I think GDP was improving. There was still questions around distribution, very unequal economy, but nevertheless, many people felt that their lives were getting better, and certainly there was an expectation that things would begin to improve. And I think that's really explains a lot of the anger of young people that had their future stolen from
Yeah.
them by the coup.
And of course, there's something else we've seen in other, like the Arab Spring. Things have changed, certainly in the technological ways. People have access to instant communications over phones and with secure apps and things like this, messaging apps. And that allows a level of organisation that the military hadn't faced, certainly in 88,
Mm.
and really hadn't faced really at all. And I think that's what also helped in get the CDM movement going, for starters, but then moved into the foundation of the People's Defence Forces, like these little, sometimes individual little militias, like village by village, who, and you've seen an amazing amount of innovation in what they're doing. So, firstly, they've started, they started and still are attacking the Myanmar army in areas they haven't seen
Mm.
fighting since the 40s or 50s, sometimes even before that, like the very heartlands. And even today, I saw a video, some guys attacking, doing a drive-by on a police post in, I think, in Yangon. These are PDF guys who have got heavy AKs and M16s. Who knows where they got them from, but they've got them in. And they shoot up this post and disappear into the streets. And of course, you're seeing this great innovation with like things like the drones, the reporting, the sheer like the fact that they can get what's going on. Like for what happened with the CDM movement initially, with million people marching, the world can suddenly go, "Oh, this is a problem," and then the retaliation and showing the world what the people in Myanmar are having to deal with. And of course, it's just changed the game.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there are some real striking similarities with the 1988 uprising,
Mm.
and the way that that led to a wave of activists fleeing to the border areas, and some of them
The
took up arms, and
ABPSDF,
ABSDF, yeah, the
yeah.
All Burma Students Democratic Front. But no one really has a handle on numbers in Myanmar, to be honest. But clearly, the number of mostly young people who have protested against the military coup on the streets, but also have fled the cities and joined resistance movements, often taking up arms as
Mm.
parts of people's defense forces, joining the national unity government, or even working as health or education workers in opposition controlled areas. The numbers are, I think, much greater than 1988. And
Oh,
as you said, the technologies are really
mm.
transformative. The ways in which the internet and information technology have been used by the revolutionary forces. I think that's a huge difference to 1988. And that also, as you said, has been translated into technologies of warfare as well,
Mm.
drone warfare. I remember meeting some activists who were recently arrived in ethnic areas from the cities, talking about how they were going to build mortars and other munitions. And honestly, I was pretty skeptical.
Yeah.
But these guys, they had couple of them had engineering degrees.
Yeah.
They got hold of the materials and they built that kit.
Yeah.
And I think that tech savvy and the way that drones, as you mentioned, have been used so widely by the anti-junta forces.
Mm.
Also, of course, drones are used by the Myanmar army, and this is
Yes.
this is
Yes.
a
It's a real
phenomena of
problem.
warfare across the world in the
Mm.
21st century. But the ways in which the opposition forces have been able to mobilize drone warfare is another huge difference to
Yeah.
1988.
Well, because I mean, the big advantage the Myanmar army has, okay, they have the drones, which are Chinese, Russian, and I think Israeli models, but they have the artillery and they have air power in particular. And that's what's allowing them really to hang in there. That's the only thing allowing them to hang in there. But they are being countered in a lot of ways by drones. But I think pretty much all of the ethnic forces, certainly ones that border China and Thailand, have extensive drone units. And that's their sort of air power and artillery
Yeah.
equivalent. They
Mm.
really are laying it on heavy on some of these
Yeah.
attacks.
So one of the most striking developments of the last 3 years since the coup has been the Operation 1027,
Yeah.
launched by three of the northern ethnic armed organizations, so the MNDAA, the TNLA,
Chinese.
and the AA. With that's your point. I know that
Yeah.
they were hugely successful. Over a
Yes.
period
Yeah.
of just a few weeks, these three armed groups overran hundreds of Myanmar army
Mm.
bases, and they've taken control of dozens of towns.
Yeah.
It's really unprecedented, at least since the 1940s and early
Yeah.
1950s.
Yeah.
And how were they able to do this? I mean, organization. Having talked to some of these groups, they spent quite a long time in the planning.
Yeah.
So I think they were really tight
Hmm.
in the strategic planning. I think they played it very close. So personally, I was aware that there would be offensive coming from the north, but in terms of the timing and the specifics, I had no idea, and
Hmm.
I think very few people did. So they kept the planning really tight. But one of the big game changers was access to field munitions,
Yeah.
field guns and munitions, which I think only can have come from China, and the use of drones, massive use of drones, drone swarms to dislodge the Myanmar army from reinforced
Yeah. Which again must have
downtown
been
positions.
from China. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have first-hand knowledge about that, but there's
No.
only a
No.
certain number of places you can get
Yeah.
this.
Well, they
I
border
think the
China. I think.
smaller drones, which many of the groups use, can be bought
Yeah.
commercially,
Civilian. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then you can fit them out with
Yes.
grenades and other
Yeah.
explosives.
Yeah.
The larger drones, I think, are more difficult to get hold of,
Yeah.
and I think it's no secret that many of these northern groups have long-standing relationships
Yeah.
with China.
And I mean, it's one of the things that always comes up. We've certainly talked about, but anyone who deals with the Karen situation, which borders Thailand, they have a real problem with the aircraft. They don't have any counter
Yeah,
Burmese army, but the Northern Alliance, they do. They have man-portable missile systems, which are Chinese made. And I'm not saying they have many of them, but they certainly have them, and they have used them. And that's a real problem for the Burmese military aircraft, which are in limited numbers. You know, they're not that many of them. So it's noticeable they're much more, I think, cagey about operating in the north than they are against Karen, for example.
absolutely. Yeah, I spent a month in December, January, in the 3rd and 5th Brigade areas of the KNU,
That's the Karen National
in
Union,
the
yeah.
Karen National Union. So this is Northern Karen State and
Hmm.
Eastern Bago region, and these are areas which I visited back in the day before the 2012 KNU ceasefire. And back then, the hills were controlled by the insurgents.
Hmm.
The foothills was kind of the front line where the fighting happened, and the river valley, the Sitang River Valley, had been controlled by the Myanmar government and army since the early 1950s.
Yeah.
So I remember standing on the edge of the hills, looking down into the river valley, and thinking, "Gosh, I wonder if I'll ever get to visit." Fast forward a few years, I was, as you said, involved as a sort of a bit player, but I had a pretty good view of the early days of the peace process between
Hmm.
the KNU and other armed groups and the Myanmar government and military. So I visited some of those areas again, but this time traveling from Yangon
Yeah.
with as part of a sort of international delegation together with senior Myanmar army and
Hmm.
government officials. Actually, I was actually the second person, I think, ever to be handed over by the Myanmar army to the KNU on the front line. And I actually crossed the front line and spent some time in KNU areas before returning again. But back in those days, the ceasefire front line had been kind of frozen.
Yeah.
And if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be coming back to these areas a decade later and it would all be controlled by the KNU,
Mm.
I wouldn't have believed it.
Yeah.
So to go back there and to see that not only the hills and the foothills, but the really most of the river valley, with some exceptions, but most of the river valley, particularly on the east bank of the Sitang River,
Mhm.
but also large areas of the west bank of the Sitang River, liberated by the KNU and these People's Defence Forces that you talked
Mhm.
about. Extraordinary. I mean,
Yeah.
really, as someone who's been working with these groups, with the KNU in particular, for a couple of decades, it felt like this is what victory feels like. I mean, to have pushed the Myanmar army back so far
Yeah.
and to have taken control of huge areas which had never been under KNU control, at least since the 1950s,
Mm.
such an achievement. On the other hand, many of the villages we passed were abandoned or
Mhm.
at least semi deserted, many destroyed bridges, schools, and hospitals which had been closed down. And I think that really showed me the humanitarian impact, the human
Yeah.
consequence of the war. But what was particularly interesting for you regarding drones and airstrikes is back in the day, before the ceasefire, the biggest risk really was running into a Myanmar army patrol in the jungle.
Yeah.
And, we came across evidence on various missions I was involved with of very serious human rights abuses against villagers by the Myanmar army, burning down of villages,
Mhm.
using villagers as forced porters,
Yeah.
torture, killing. But that was all done by ground forces. These days, in the areas that have been liberated by ethnic armed organizations, there is no Myanmar army.
Yeah.
They've disappeared. They've been forced out
Yeah.
and have retreated. And yet, these are still places of great insecurity
Yes.
with drones overhead,
Yeah.
with artillery and airstrikes. And I think that's the point, that the main constraint on anti-junta forces really consolidating their control,
Mhm.
delivering services, health and education, but also the main threat to basic human security and survival. And the
Yeah.
thing that is killing villagers are the airstrikes by the Myanmar
Yeah.
army and artillery strikes. And a lot of that is coordinated through drones. So I think you're right that one of the big differences between the groups in the north and the Karen and other groups in the southeast is that in the north they do seem to have access to better ground to air defences. And
Mhm.
that's been one of my advocacy points, particularly this year when I have sometimes occasion to talk to donors or diplomats or journalists. But really, for the last couple of years, is to point out the urgent need for ground to air defences
Yeah.
in order to consolidate the gains of the anti junta opposition, but also to protect civilians
I mean,
from death and terror that comes from Myanmar army airstrikes and also artillery that's kind of guided by
yeah.
surveillance drones.
I mean, absolutely, and it's long been a bugbear of mine, but certainly since the coup and like this situation has developed, is the amount of places you see calls for no fly zones. If ever there was a place that really warranted a no-fly zone, it's Burma, like, an actual international operation. But there is zero interest in that, and that's a whole
Hmm.
topic on its own, really, as to why there's a lot of platitudes get thrown around, but no real action, not even of a minimal nature. It's one of another bugbear of mine is I quite often see comments whenever I do a video about Burma about is the CIA behind this, and they go, I wish the CIA had one guy in the field here because I'm pretty sure they don't, or they might have a guy, but there is nothing coming. The only people who are actually involved are really, I guess, the neighbours. The main suppliers for the Myanmar army do appear to be China and India, who have their own. I
And
mean,
Russia.
and Russia, yes, yeah, who are just in it for the sales, I'm sure. But well, I don't know actually. No, there's long running ties between the Myanmar military and Russia, aren't there?
There are, and I think one aspect of this is the Chinese perception that Myanmar during the days of military dictatorship was part of the Chinese sphere of influence.
Yeah.
And it was actually under the U Thein Sein administration that Myanmar moved away from China.
Hmm.
And it was during the U Thein Sein government that there were visits by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama.
Yeah.
And really, the US managed to prize Myanmar away from China. And this was, I think, regarded as one of the foreign policy achievements of the Obama administration.
Hmm.
Ironically, under Aung San Suu Kyi, particularly after the Myanmar army genocidal campaigns against the Rohingya in Bangladesh,
Hmm.
and with Aung San Suu Kyi then basically acting as an apologist for
Yeah.
genocide,
Yeah.
which was really appalling given her status as an international human rights icon,
Yeah.
that actually served to move Myanmar back into the Chinese sphere of influence.
Mm.
So I think there is real geopolitics there. During up until the coup, Russia really hasn't had a toehold in Southeast Asia since the
Mm.
end of the Vietnam War. So I think although there are questions about how much Russia can really continue to supply the Myanmar army given the drain on
Yeah.
Russian resources in Ukraine. At the moment, the Myanmar Air Force and the bombs they're using, the planes they're using, are mostly supplied by Russia.
Yeah.
And this has actually allowed Russia to have much more of a strategic presence in Southeast Asia, more so than any time in the last several decades.
Hmm.
And I think this is partly why it's important to think about America's interest in the region,
Hmm.
because many of the groups that we're talking about do have narratives and identities that are committed to a rights-based approach to governance
Yeah.
and to democratic political cultures. And of course, that's easy to say. And if we look at how some of these groups operate on the ground, often it's not quite like that.
Yeah.
But I think for most of the groups I've been talking about, there's a strong, at least rhetorical commitment to something that is a sort of rights-based, rules-based, if not completely democratic form of governance.
Mhm.
So many of these groups feel, I think, ideologically much closer to the West and particularly to the US than
Yeah.
they do to China. But China is the superpower that has provided most of the support. So I think there's a feeling among many of the anti-junta forces that they expect to get more support from the West.
Mm.
Because they feel that their values are aligned with the West and they see Western support to the resistance against Russian invasion in Ukraine, which of
Yeah.
course is a very different context. And there's a feeling of, I think there's a growing cynicism actually, but there's certainly an unhappiness that the West hasn't actually stepped up
Yeah.
with greater support. But in terms of the American interest, and no-fly zones. So I'm sure you're right about no-fly zones, but also, as you were saying, it kind of feels not very realistic politically in the short to middle term because really to implement a no-fly zone you would need cooperation of the Thai authorities.
Yeah. It'd
And
have
the
to be.
Thai military, I think, is going through a bit of a soul-searching period at the moment.
Mhm.
I think there's a growing realization that Thailand's Myanmar policy doesn't work. I mean, just look at the mess of Myanmar.
Yeah.
So I think Thai policy is shifting, but nevertheless, that's against the background of the Royal Thai Army having very close relations with the Myanmar Army and junta.
Yeah.
So no-fly
And
zones, maybe not. But
and China also flexing a little bit into Thailand as well.
well, yeah, Thailand, I think for hundreds of years, really, right back to the colonial period, balancing against British and
Yeah.
French interests in the region. So sometimes more by luck than judgment, but I think Thai governments, Thai elites over the centuries have been pretty good at hedging against
Yeah.
different
And
power
they're doing that
players.
now.
And now in Chiang Mai, we have $1 billion US consulate being built, but
Yeah.
also many Chinese tourists and other visitors from
Yeah.
China and
Yeah.
many Chinese investments in Thailand. So that game continues
Yeah.
balancing against China and the US. So I think Thailand is unlikely to welcome increased assistance,
Western
Western, certainly
military.
military assistance.
Yeah.
But my view would be that, well, we know that there are different scenarios for the future. And my understanding is that both the US and Chinese strategic planning, one of the most likely scenarios is some kind of conflict between those two countries.
Mm.
It's not inevitable, but I think it's certainly one of the scenarios that is being prepared for.
Mm.
And in that context, ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar, I think, can be seen as potential proxies and allies for either side.
Yeah.
And given that China has very significant assets in Myanmar,
Yeah.
belt and road investments, but particularly the route from Yunnan province down to the Rakhine coast into the Indian
Yes. Yeah.
Ocean is really China's main way of avoiding Singapore and the Malaccan Straits,
Yeah.
and which could potentially be cut off quite quickly by the US if there was a future armed conflict. So Myanmar is actually pretty important to China geostrategically. And in that context, I think that some of the groups that we're talking about maybe have quite important roles to play in future geopolitical clashes and basically conflict between China and the US.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, the Arakan, they, in Myanmar news, the Arakan sort of skate under the radar even then. And that's surprising because they have done heck of a lot in the west of the country, the Arakan and Rakhine state on Bangladesh-Indian border. And as you said, there are huge gas fields off there. The big port of Sittwe is being built, the improving
Yep.
port, with Chinese money, as you point out. big pipeline being built, even with the war going on, I believe it's still going on. And the Arakan have taken a huge amount of territory. I think they control most of that border now. There are all sorts of stories about what's going on over there, but no one can get in to find out.
Mm.
They keep them very much themselves. And the Arakan are a classic example, I think, of problems with the future of Myanmar. Of a lot of people have this expectation that, oh yeah, the baddies will go, as we talked earlier about the Star Wars ending. Oh, they'll beat the bad guys. Everyone will have a big party. There'll be fireworks. Yay, we won. That doesn't seem like it happened. And the Arakan is certainly an example of that. They seem to be very much set up for a bit like the war are now, and the war will be the same as always. But I'm all right, Jack. This is mine. Go away.
Yeah, there's a particularly difficult set of issues in Arakan around the Rohingya community.
There's a Rohingya.
And there's a lot to say about this. I'm not an expert.
No.
I think it needs to be acknowledged in any discussion like this that there have been Muslim populations in Rakhine State for hundreds of years.
Mhm.
Also, that many Muslims migrated to Arakan during the British colonial period, but the ancestors of the Rohingya, maybe some have arrived more recently, but many of them have been there for a long time. So I think the claim of the Rohingya to have a place in Rakhine State is pretty well grounded. But at the same time, the Rakhine community, who are the majority group in that state, have experienced decades of violent oppression by the Myanmar majority that control the military and the state, as have the Karen and other ethnic minorities. So we have a situation now, as you were saying, where the Arakan army have made huge battlefield gains over the last couple of years. They're not the only ethnic armed organization to have achieved significant battlefield victories in the last couple of years, but certainly in the last few days and weeks, the Arakan army have taken over more and more territory. And it does seem that this has driven conflicts between the Arakan army and the Rohingya, which has the potential to, of course, be disastrous for the people involved and for the country overall, because there is a historical pattern of violent abuse against the Rohingya, genocide against the Rohingya, which has been committed by the Myanmar army, not by the Arakanese. Yeah. But there is a sense, at least among some members of the Arakan community, and maybe some leaders of the Arakan army have even questioned the legitimacy of the Rohingya as an ethnic group, whether they should really be regarded as an ethnic nationality of Burma alongside some of the other groups that we've been talking about. And I think as we speak at the moment, it's very much in play. And certainly some observers, people who follow the events more closely than me, are very concerned about how tensions between the Arakan community and particularly the Arakan army and the Rohingya may develop. Up until pretty recently, I think the Arakan army has really gone out of its way to not discriminate against the Rohingya, to recognise maybe not the name Rohingya because that's so sensitive among the Arakan nationalists, but at least to acknowledge that these are human beings who need to have their rights respected. And so I think we have to hope that those basic human values are maintained, but certainly there's the potential for intercommunal conflict. And as you were saying, I think it's particularly difficult and nasty in Rakhine, but the potential for inter-ethnic conflict in a context where the dominant chauvinistic, racist, really fascist state of Myanmar has collapsed in many areas, allowing ethnic communities to reassert their own self-determination. That's often happening in a context where you have more than one ethnic group living in a particular area. Yeah. And these kind of tensions, I think there are ways forward that can help to avoid violence and conflict spilling over into violence, but the potential is there for significant intercommunal tensions. Yeah, I think needs to be handled very carefully.
Yeah, and you can even go further than that, even beyond the ethnic dimension. Obviously, as I say, we're talking about the foundation of the PDFs. You know, a lot of these people took up arms to defend their homes from the depredations of the Myanmar army. But what it boils down to at the end of the day is a lot of guns in a lot of hands, and not everyone's so pure of moral
young men with guns.
Yeah, and it's a bad combo. And if you've suddenly got groups, and I'm beginning to hear stories in some areas as well, they're in charge now. Yeah, you got local militia running things. Well, they're the local militia with guns running things, and that is very, very easy road to abuse.
Yes, I think if we look at the evidence so far, the great majority of human rights abuses, particularly the systematic and widespread
Mm,
abuses, are perpetrated by the Myanmar army
absolutely, yeah.
and by proxy groups working under the Myanmar army.
Absolutely,
But that's not to say that this isn't a risk for the
yeah.
future. And I think, generally speaking, ethnic armed organizations have, well, there's a great variety of different ethnic armed organizations,
Exactly, yeah.
but the more well established groups, some of those I've been talking about, have quite strong chains of command and control.
Yes, yeah.
Then we have this sort of new generation of anti junta forces, the People's Defense Forces, which really are quite also diverse.
Yes, yeah.
And it
Yeah.
seems from some of the research I've been doing, it's not surprising, but I think it's important to see that the People's Defense Forces, which are integrated with the ethnic armed organizations or closely integrated with the National Unity Government Ministry of Defense,
Mhm.
they seem to have a clearer command and control. There seems to be more accountability. I think some of these groups, some of the local PDFs, maybe some ethnic armed organizations as well that are less integrated in clear chains
Mhm.
of command and control. Yeah, there are certainly stories emerging of, unsurprisingly, yeah, young
Yeah,
men with guns being given power, angry young men.
yeah,
That abuses do occur. Yeah.
yeah. And
Overall, I'm kind of still impressed that we don't hear more of this. I mean,
yeah,
partly
I'll agree with that.
partly
Yeah,
it's a reporting bias thing. Most of the media, I think there's a wonderful, very professional media among Burmese opposition circles,
hmm,
different news outlets that do a great job. But overall, there is a feeling of solidarity with the anti-junta movement. So I think that some of these stories of abuse don't always make it out into the media. That said, overall, I think that there are less of these abuses than you might expect, but that doesn't
hmm,
mean that things couldn't get worse quickly.
yeah,
And I guess that then brings us on to sort of what the future of the country is going to look like, and what will be some of
absolutely.
the stresses and pressures that.
Yeah, because I mean, as I say, it's what was that quote? I think it's Terry Pratchett. I always come up with it. And he says, "You know what the good guys are really good at? Get rid of the bad guy. You know what the bad guys are good at? Getting the trash taken out and making sure the buses run on time." And that's it. It's one thing to get rid of the bad guys, and they do need to go, and they are going. It's just a matter of time. But what's going to happen when they're gone? Because suddenly you've got, as I say, a lot of different groups, a lot of armed groups with their own agendas. They're all held together by this one common goal. But once that's achieved, does it become every group or every man for himself, or do you think that maybe they will be able to knit it together, or will it be a combination of both? Some of the groups will work together, and some of them will just fall by the wayside. Or
Yeah, great question, and
I mean, ultimately unknown, but we're speculating. But
I think part of the answer I'd like to come back round to climate change as a driver of
okay, yeah,
conflict and what the future of Myanmar might look like. But maybe taking a step back from that, most of the ethnic forces in Myanmar, ethnic armed organizations, but also civil society groups and ethnic political parties that were quite prominent before the coup, most of them have
yeah,
been sort of locked up now or they've gone underground, have shared an agenda of struggling for federalism in
yeah,
Burma. And I think often what is meant by federalism isn't very well defined,
mm,
but I guess generally it's taken as a meaning self-determination for ethnic communities
yeah,
in a context where the state of Burma, the state of Myanmar, has since independence, but really since the British period, I think, been dominated by Bama majority elites
mm,
that have sought to forcibly assimilate minority communities.
yeah,
So the pushback narrative and insurgency over several decades, as we were discussing earlier, has been from at least some ethnic groups and some elites within ethnic groups to take up arms against this oppression. I'm one of those because of my own historical involvement with Burma. I've always worked with ethnic stakeholders,
mm,
and I've been quite a strong advocate of the justice behind these demands for self determination. From around the time that the reforms started in, let's say, 2010, 2011, through till 2020, I found it increasingly difficult to make these arguments when I would meet with diplomats or donors or journalists and would talk about the legitimacy of ethnic armed organizations
Mhm.
and the credibility of their governance authority in some areas which they still controlled in the more remote parts of the country, and this aspiration to self-determination. Most of the international community and most Burmese politicians didn't want to hear it.
Mhm.
Even after the genocide of the Rohingya in 2016, 2017, I think by and large the opinion was that we have to get behind Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD-led government. And the NLD was a very centralizing body,
Mm.
despite being supposedly democratic in its credentials. The way that the NLD governed was very heavy-handed, very authoritarian, very centralizing. So post-coup, we have a situation where the authority of the central powers in Myanmar, the junta, is weaker now than I think probably any time since independence. Arguably, the centre has never been weaker since the 18th century,
Mhm.
really, when the Kambang dynasty took power in Burma, and it was the Kambangs who were then replaced by the British, who were replaced by the independent state of Burma. So I think we have a situation now where ethnic movements are stronger than at any time for hundreds of years,
Right.
and that brings with it some of the questions that you raised. So I think in terms of political terminology, the shift has been from democratic federalism to federal democracy, to put it
Right. Yeah.
simplistically. So prior to the coup, democratic federalism is what most people talked about, certainly what the central government and many international stakeholders wanted to achieve, which is a democratic Burma, which, by the way, also addresses some ethnic demands. So
Yeah.
democracy first, federalism second. And things have really shifted since the coup, and most of the key stakeholders, particularly on the ethnic side, have seen the opportunity to really promote self-determination.
Yeah.
So federalism as being the primary agenda and democracy being somewhat a secondary consideration. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. There hasn't been a time for hundreds of years, at least in Burma, where so much of the country has been controlled by organizations that are defined in terms of a particular ethnicity.
Yeah.
We should probably talk about some recent developments towards state-based governance, but maybe like in
Mhm.
Karenni, for example. But for the moment, just to focus on the ethnic issue. So, yeah, I think that can be seen as quite problematic if we assume that the natural state of affairs in Burma is to have a centralized state run by the
Yeah.
government in Naypyidaw. But I think actually we're moving past that in terms of the realities. So the way I would see it is the emergence of a patchwork or a network, if you like, of territories that are controlled by political authorities that have a high degree of local legitimacy among the communities they seek to represent. And then the challenge is how can they join together to create a new union built from the bottom up?
Yeah.
And I think previous attempts to achieve some kind of self-determination, federalism in Burma have been very top-down.
Mhm.
So, led by the previous NLD government, for example, there was a rhetorical commitment to achieving some kind of federalism in Burma. But I think what that really looked like was the central government handing out some concessions and
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
degree of local autonomy, but very much on the patronage of the central government. And now the central government of Myanmar has collapsed, or is the SAC is illegal and illegitimate, and also just it's a failing regime.
Yeah.
And so we see this resurgence of locally determined ethnic nationality governance authorities. And yeah, I think the challenge they face now is how can they work together to
Mhm.
build a new union in the territory of Burma from the bottom up.
Yeah.
So I think there is some reason for hope that this project can achieve a degree of success. There are alliances between many of these organizations. Some of the biggest difficulties exist where the authority of one group overlaps with another.
Yeah.
So Karen and Mon, or Kachin and Taang, where you have an armed group representing that particular community that is occupying territory overlapping with areas traditionally occupied by members of a different ethnic group.
Mhm.
I think there's ways of moving forward with these kind of issues. And as I just referenced earlier, one of the most interesting developments in Burma, I think, in the last 2 or 3 years since the coup, is the emergence of state-based governance authorities.
Mhm.
So up until the coup, we had ethnic armed organizations, which,
Yeah.
as I mentioned, have been fighting in some cases for decades, and they would control sometimes quite extensive territory. So the Karen National Union still controls large areas of Burma, and it has a para-state-like structure
Yeah.
with its own government and a cabinet, departments of health, education, agriculture, fisheries, tax and finance, etc. I think 14 different government departments, if I remember correctly. So it's almost like a sort of para-state structure
Mm.
in the name of a particular ethnic group. And that's actually proved to be very resilient over
Yeah,
the
yeah,
years.
yeah.
But I think the direction since the coup is a bit different. And I suppose the most well-known example would be Karenni state, also in the southeast, where the ethnic armed organization, in this case the Karenni National Progressive Party, has joined forces with the new generation of People's Defence Forces from the towns and the cities to create new governance structures which are not so much defined in terms of a particular ethnic group,
Hmm.
but are much more inclusive and multi-ethnic. So in Karenni, we
Okay.
have an area of Karenni which is quite multi-ethnic and where members of a variety of different ethno-linguistic groups have come together to join with the long-standing ethnic armed organizations that have been fighting for decades, to create a new, more inclusive resistance movement and
Hmm.
governance structure that includes roles for civil society organizations, for women and youth groups. So I think that's actually a really positive development that
Interesting.
goes
Yeah.
quite a long way towards addressing those concerns of intergroup factional fighting, which I think that is a risk.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with a young Kachin guy, ooh, I don't know, 2014, I think it was. And I was asking these Kachin students what they wanted for the future. And this was before the coup, like war still going on in Kachin. And they all said, "Oh, we want a federal Myanmar." And this young lad went, "I want a confederate state of Myanmar." And I went, "What do you mean by that?" He went, "We want to do our own thing. We just want the central government to deal like with the foreigners."
Yeah,
And then we'll do our own stuff, and then they can just talk to the outside world. And that's all they do. They don't have any other power. We'll do our own militaries. We'll all be together as one country, but we're all independent effectively. And I always thought that was an interesting idea. I also said to him, that's never going to happen. But that is
it's happening.
theoretically, yeah,
And
likely to be the case.
I think the key there is not to get all sort of academic about it, but it's about where does sovereignty lie?
Yeah.
Where does political authority really lie? And I think the assumption in the modern nation state system globally, since really the last 300 years, has been that authority lies with a central government,
Hmm.
like it or not. And I think that's really been challenged in Burma.
Yeah.
And I would say that because the state of Burma was never really credible for many ethnic
Hmm.
nationality
Yeah.
citizens. I mean, Burma was created by the British out of a Bama empire
Yeah.
that was built by
Which
the Bama majority by
who
force.
conquered? Yeah.
And then there was an interesting decade in the 1950s when there was an experiment in parliamentary democracy in Burma, and then the Myanmar army took over, and
And
Burma has been ruled by the
yeah,
Myanmar army
didn't
ever since.
didn't really let go despite the flirtations in
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
2010s. Yeah.
So I think for many ethnic nationality people, Burma has never been an authentic or credible country.
Yeah.
Um,
And that will be a problem for the NUG, I think, in the future,
absolutely.
where I think they obviously hold themselves up as the legitimate government of Myanmar and broadcast it very loudly. But I'm pretty sure if you talk to the Karen, the Kachin, the bigger groups, they're like, yeah, sure, just don't forget what you owe us, because you have nothing without our support.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the ethnic nationality politicians, particularly the battle-hardened
Mm,
ethnic armed organisations, have actually tried to accommodate the NUG,
yeah,
and there has been some successful partnership and collaboration in some areas. I think part of the problem is that the National Unity Government, we should say, on the one hand, National Unity Government is probably more inclusive than previous Myanmar
yeah.
exile regimes. So there's quite a large number of ethnic people in the NUG, mostly in deputy ministerial positions. And the NUG also has, I think, something like 30-40% women participation as
Mm,
well, which is really unheard of in Myanmar to have so many women involved in top leadership positions. So that's a good thing. But having said that, the NUG is still basically dominated by, long story short, dominated by the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's party. That is a predominantly Bama party
mhm.
that has a long tradition of centralizing state-led politics. So prior to the coup, I used to say, what's the difference between the Myanmar army and the NLD? They have different views about how to achieve power. The NLD view is that power should be achieved through Western-style parliamentary elections, which I'm not sure is very relevant in a country like Burma, but anyway.
Yeah,
And the Myanmar army view is that power is achieved through the legacy of
through the power of a gun.
through the barrel of a gun, but also, their narrative would be that they defeated the colonialists, and that's where their
Yeah, yeah,
legitimacy comes from. So, but once they get in power, I mean, NLD locked up plenty of people when they were
Yeah.
running the country. Not quite as many as the Myanmar army did. I don't want to say there's a complete equivalence there. I think the NLD weren't quite as bad as the Myanmar army, but certainly they displayed a very centralising tendency.
Mm.
And I think that's carried over into the NUG. So there's a kind of, I think, an assumption when you listen to NUG leaders talking, they have this sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
And so they'll talk about, for example, I heard an NUG minister a few months ago talking about the NUG has 5,000 schools in Myanmar.
Really?
Well, no, it's not true at
Where
all.
are they? Yeah.
I think the NUG has about 100 schools in Myanmar,
Oh, I'm impressed to have
and
that
the
many.
rest, maybe not that many. The rest of the schools that he was referencing are implemented by ethnic armed
Yeah, I was
organizations.
going
And
to
so
say, yeah.
there's maybe 1 million children going to schools in Myanmar that are administered by ethnic armed organizations.
Mm.
Just in the southeast, the KNU and Newman State Party, just two of those groups, have 120 in and outpatient departments under their administration. So
Yeah.
these ethnic administrations provide services and governance. And so the point about the NUG is, of course, when they claim that this is NUG, it's not NUG, it's the
Yeah.
local organizations. And so I think that kind of points to the NUG maybe overclaiming the relevance of their role. But I think you're right that you were talking about your conversations with Myanmar people, and I think there is a need for some kind of union level body,
Mm.
but my thinking is that, and this is reflecting, of course, many conversations with friends and colleagues in and from Burma, that the union level federal government needs to be very light touch. So
Mm.
yeah, foreign relations, maybe a few things like currency.
Hmm.
In the field of education, which is a lot of work I do is in education, and I mentioned the schools and most of the ethnic systems, governance systems, they have their own education regimes using their own local languages.
Yeah.
But I think there is a need for standardization so that there's a basic agreement on what should be known by a primary school student, what should be included
Hmm.
in 10th standard matriculation and matriculation examinations.
Right. Yeah.
So that kind of basic standard setting, I think, is maybe another role which in the field of education that a union government could play.
Yeah.
So the coming back to confederation, I guess the basic point there is that confederation assumes that ethnic nations are sovereign. They
Yeah.
determine their own political future, and they may choose to join together for some things and
Mm.
to pool that sovereignty, and then you have a union level federal government. But the difference since the coup being that we start on the basis of ethnic sovereignty,
Hmm.
and those ethnic sovereign bodies decide what things that they might
Yeah.
share and pool together, rather than the case before the coup, where we start with a centralized state and decide which bits could be sort of doled out piecemeal to the ethnics. So
Hmm.
I think we're looking at a much more radical, bottom-up, emergent approach
Yeah.
to federalism.
To go back to what you mentioned, climate change,
Right.
and because obviously we're talking about the politics and potential conflicts in the future, but you think there might be a much more significant danger in the future, which isn't actually being addressed, but could actually
Yeah.
destroy Myanmar.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we've been talking about so far, it's interesting and important. It's
Mm.
background. Um, I think that climate change is going to be a massive game changer in Myanmar.
Hmm.
Last month in April, 7 of the 15 hottest cities in the world were in Myanmar. So the various studies regard Myanmar as probably the second most climate change vulnerable country in Asia for a number of different reasons to do with geography and the position of the country in relation to the Indian Ocean, cyclones, other factors as well. So we can already see the impacts of climate change across Myanmar. I think that rice crops are beginning to fail in some parts of the country. There's been increasing flooding over the last few years. And basically, there are 3 or 4 different types of hazard which the country faces.
Hmm.
So, cyclones in the Bay of Bengal, which can really affect communities living inside the country, not just in coastal areas, rising sea levels and increasing salination of low-lying agricultural areas, including places like the Irrawaddy Delta, which produces so much of Myanmar's rice. But most important, it's rainfall and temperature.
Hmm.
So what we see already is a decrease in the number of days of the rainy season, but no decrease in the amount of rain falling.
Hmm.
So Myanmar rainy season has decreased from about 150, 160 days in the 1980s to about 120 days, and this data is now a few years old, so it's probably even less than that now.
Yeah.
So the rainy season is 30 days shorter, but the amount of rain is more or less the same, maybe even a little bit more. So you have more intense rainfall, which leads to soil erosion, but particularly to flash flooding. And this has really devastating impacts on agriculture and loss of life. And probably the most significant factor in climate change is rising temperatures.
Yeah.
So we've already seen globally, we're I think at about 1.2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Myanmar's a little bit higher than that. I think average temperatures in Myanmar are already 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels. More data is becoming available, and scientists are developing projections for future climate change patterns. I think some of this stuff is because I work on climate change and I mix in academic circles, I'm aware of some data that's going to be published later in the year. And this is particularly projections looking at the future. So the future climate change patterns in Myanmar will be largely determined by global carbon emissions.
Right.
And there's a real climate justice issue here because Myanmar has done very little to contribute towards the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's one of the least industrialized countries in Asia, so really not responsible for the damage that the planet is undergoing. And yet Myanmar is so vulnerable to climate change. So what that looks like in terms of temperatures, actually, I think will be devastating.
Yeah.
So we know that human beings cannot survive for very long in temperatures above 37 degrees centigrade. So there's a difference between what they call wet bulb and dry bulb temperatures.
Yeah.
So maybe in terms of like absolute temperatures, 40 degrees centigrade is a sensible cutoff point. So last year there were a small handful of days above 40 degrees centigrade in central Myanmar. Hundreds of people died of climate induced factors, so climate stress. The projection is that sometime within the next 7 to 20 years, and that variation depends on global carbon emissions. So it could be as soon as 2030, maybe as late as 2040, that there will be 40 or 50 days in the year above 40 degrees centigrade. And we're talking particularly here now the central low-lying dry zone of Myanmar, where about 12 million people live.
Yeah.
So those human beings will be unable to survive in those conditions unless they have access to air conditioning, which most people don't. In fact, we're talking about places like Mandalay, Sagaing, Magway regions, which are at the epicenter of resistance against the SAC junta and have been devastated by airstrikes, as we were talking earlier, and other attacks. So many people in these areas are presently living as IDPs in temporary shelters and appalling conditions. But even if they were back home in their houses, it's very difficult for humans to survive that many days per year at that temperature. And also the rice crop will begin to fail, and I think that's starting to happen already, the combination of flooding and increased temperatures, all of which means that it's really quite difficult to see how basic human security and livelihoods can be maintained in the central low-lying Bama populated areas of the country, which are the core of the state of Myanmar. So I think this has terrifying consequences really for basic human survival. And the political implications are that the state of Myanmar is unlikely to remain viable as a coherent
State
entity.
Anyway.
Yeah, so these sort of discussions which we often hear from right across the political board about after the revolution. I mean, I guess there are discussions in Naypyidaw about after we win, although I'm obviously not part of that and it seems very unlikely. And there are certainly plenty of discussions in opposition circles and in the international community about what happens after the collapse of the SAC. Clearly, the SAC and the Myanmar army are doing worse than any previous government in Myanmar on the battlefield. It's possible that the Myanmar army and SAC may collapse, although I'm not really convinced of that at all. But in a way, I guess my point is that that's not the biggest question, because if the state of Myanmar is no longer viable, to a certain extent, it doesn't really matter who's in charge. It's going to be chaos.
Yeah.
In this future scenario, of course, it's a range of different scenarios, and we can't be sure because, of course, the science is pretty clear, but the carbon emissions globally are still, contested.
Yeah.
But in the sort of most likely future scenarios, and certainly in some of the less optimistic scenarios, the impacts will be devastating. And it looks like upland areas where ethnic nationality communities mostly live, where the groups that we've been talking about earlier mostly operate, will be more resilient. I mean, they will also experience temperature rises. The flooding and increased in violent rainfall will be particularly pronounced in upland
Yeah,
areas. So
yeah.
they're certainly going to have major challenges. And among those challenges, really, there's an urgent need right now to start work on climate change adapted agriculture. So I could get into that. That's one of my sort of favorite, although I'm not an agriculturalist, I think it's such an urgent task. So clearly there are massive challenges, but overall, the ethnic peoples of Myanmar have suffered violence and underdevelopment for centuries.
Yeah.
Certainly during the whole period of the modern state of Myanmar, they've been subject to violence. So people are tough.
Mm.
They love and support each other. They learn to work together, and so there is incredible resilience among communities, often based on common faith and ethno-linguistic identity. And also, these upland areas are less densely populated
Yeah.
than the lowlands. They've got significant natural resources, including forest cover. And the forest cover is really important for trying to maintain some degree of ecological stability, at least at a local level.
Mhm.
So, because of the low population density, because of the victory of the groups that operate out of these areas, in particularly the last few years on the battlefield, and because of the differential impacts of climate change, I think it's likely that these ethnic states that we're talking about, which already have a new impetus, and I think credibility as political entities because of the way they have responded so strongly to the coup, have probably better prospects long term of making it through the 21st
Mm.
century and being more resilient. So, in that sense, I think that we're looking at a terrifying period of suffering across the planet, but maybe some parts of Myanmar will come out of this better than other parts
Perhaps ironically because of the last half century of warfare.
because they've learned to do with very little and to support each other. And I think also there's a widespread appreciation of the value of forests as well. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of why are these areas still forested and therefore likely to be more resilient to climate change? I mean, it's partly because upland areas are more difficult to log,
Yeah.
but it's also, I think, because indigenous communities in these areas have very strong sense of stewardship, and they
Mm.
feel themselves to be custodians of the land, and so they've kept the forests and the other elements of the biodiversity that exists in these areas is largely because of the struggle and the identities of the indigenous communities that
Mhm.
live there.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're coming towards the end. So I have to ask you one final subject. You're not just a academic and quasi-journalist,
Not
and
even an academic or journalist,
and
really.
diplomat, and you're also a novelist.
I'm a jack of all trades. That's
Yeah.
right. Yes.
You've recently written a novel.
Thank you very much. Yes,
Yeah.
for
So time for your blurb. There
thank
we
you
go.
for the opportunity to plug Nancy and the Count Vampire's Gold, which is my first novel. So I've written 5 books about Burma,
Yeah.
or well, 3 books I've written, and then 2 are kind of edited volumes.
Right.
Most recent one was last year, and that's about kind of the climate change politics.
Yeah.
I actually started out, don't laugh, but I started out as a poet.
Oh.
In my early 20s, I always wanted to be a writer, and I published a few poems and failed to make my fortune as a poet, and then came out here and got involved in the aid world and the Burma scene.
Mhm.
And long story short, I kind of gave up on that career. And then a couple of years ago, actually around the time when I got COVID, like so many people did,
Yeah.
and I think that must have been partly responsible for this sort of burst of inspiration, which ended with me basically writing the first draft of a novel over the course of about 6 weeks. And then over the next 6 months, I kind of revised it and kind of realized quickly that it was going to be pretty difficult to find a publisher. So I set up my own publishing company, Frogmort Press,
Okay.
and basically self-published the novel,
Yeah.
Nancy and the Count. It is a climate change vampire adventure.
Now that's
I think
not a combination of
I
Seems
think
like
it.
here,
I think it's
interesting
the
here.
best climate change vampire adventure ever written. If not, it's certainly the greatest climate change vampire adventure set in Burma and Thailand and London.
Yeah.
So Nancy, the protagonist, is a Karen refugee woman.
All right.
She kills a vampire in London.
Uh-huh.
This leads to a chain of adventures and clues that go through the bowels of the British Museum and eventually lead her to a showdown with the Count, who is an evil vampire siding with the Burmese military junta. So it's a bit fashionable these days to have sexy, attractive vampires. Not in my novels. It's the vampires are the bad
Yeah,
guys,
old
and they're
school.
on the side of the military junta, and there's a showdown in the hills of Korthule between the good guys and the bad guys.
That's an interesting concept.
Well, I writing it for me was just so liberating because having written 5 books before, and
Hmm.
I mean, I think always, like even this evening, I only really know what I think once I start saying it or writing it.
Yeah, yeah,
But writing non-fiction books, you plan it in advance, and I have a pretty,
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
working on another one at the moment. I have a fairly good idea what's going to be in there.
Hmm.
Whereas the novel really just came to me, and I think this is a common experience, but I kind of really feel that there's a whole universe of stories and characters there. Just my job was just to sort of shut up really and let them tell their story. And I had no idea that I was going to write a novel about a Karen refugee woman. And Nancy quite quickly established herself. Then she introduced this chap Sorwa that she apparently fancied and eventually gets married to. I tried to kill Sorwa 3 times, and each time he came back to life again. And it was very clear that Sorwa and Nancy and the characters, they had their own story, and it was already pretty much well established. And
Fair
I
enough.
realised quite quickly that and there were a few points where I couldn't kind of work out quite how the plot was supposed to go, and then I realised quite quickly that actually it was going to be fine, and that they knew the plot was there. And so I kind of felt like, yeah, I had to step back and just let the story come out. And that
Okay.
was a really exhilarating experience. Of course, it's not for me, really, as the writer to judge whether it's any good, but it was certainly fun to write. And I'm
Well,
planning to do another one. So.
where can people get your book so they can
Well,
make this
thank you for
judgment
asking.
themselves? Yeah.
Well, you can buy the ebook online,
Uh-huh.
and Lulu is an ebook publisher, so that's probably the easiest place to go. So Lulu, lulu.com. You can search for Ashley South or my pen name, actually, Frank Merrifellow. That's the thing to search for.
Okay.
I did publish under a pen name, and the title of the novel, Nancy and the Count.
Okay.
Or you could go to the Frogmort Press website, or you can go to my Ashley South website. So
That's actually South.
ashleysouth.co.uk.
Okay.
That's me. And Frogmort Press is also me. And either of those you can click to buy an ebook, or you can buy the hard copy from Barnes and Noble
Oh,
and other
really?
good
Ooh.
publishers. Yes, yeah.
Wow.
Or if you're in Thailand, we've produced a Mesot edition. So it's a locally produced edition,
Oh, wow.
which is cheaper and actually has a few less typos, to be honest.
Okay.
And that's available in Mesot, in the Borderland Bookshop, Chiang Mai, at the Golden Land Solidarity Collective, and also at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand in Bangkok. So
Okay.
if you're in Bangkok, Mesot, or Chiang Mai, you can buy a hard copy for about less than $10.
Sounds like
Um,
a
or
steal.
you could go online and spend 3 times that much money and buy the same book from Barnes and Noble. Or you can buy the ebook, or you can lobby Netflix to turn it into a movie or a miniseries.
Well, I hear they're always after scripts, so maybe you should try
Yeah, they haven't come knocking yet, but
that.
it came to me as a series of. It's very filmic. I think it's
Mhm.
people who've read the book have been kind enough to say it's kind of very visual, and so it did come to me as a series of scenes. I think it would make a great movie or miniseries. Or
But obviously, you're completely unbiased.
yes, of course I am. Yes, yes.
Okay, well, I think that wraps everything up. Is there anything else you want to add, or
No, great. Thank you for
no?
thanks for allowing me to talk about the
No,
novel at the end.
thank
And
you.
it's a subject, the whole Burma thing is something I'm so passionate about. It's been my life for a quarter of a century now, so it's great
Yeah.
to have the chance to talk about it.
No, absolutely. And I've been really looking forward to having this conversation with you, and we've been planning it for a while now. But yeah, thank you very much for coming on, and I hope everyone out there enjoyed it and learned something. And stay tuned because I hope to find some other guests soon. Thanks very much, folks. Have a good one.